Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, September 17th, 2015. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, part one of Small Barrel Sour Strategies from homebrewer CJ Shamas. In this conversation, CJ takes us from procuring a barrel and preparing it for beer to blending and packaging tasty sours. If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And if you buy any of our DVD combos, you get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener. You can follow me on Twitter. My username is Basic Brewing, all one word. We have a Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video page on Facebook at facebook.com/Basic Brewing. We're on the Google Plus as well. Thanks again to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first on basicbrewing.com. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show. We greatly appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site as well. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes. Our Android app is on Amazon.com. We have a Windows phone app. We're on the BlackBerry podcast directory. We're on the Stitcher app. We're just everywhere. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support, and thanks to everybody who's done so already. I want to start this week with congratulations to Andy Sparks and the Home Brewery in Fayetteville, Arkansas, for 20 years of service to the Northwest Arkansas homebrewing community. Andy and his buddy Steve Foley started the home brewery 2 decades ago and helped to introduce many a local brewer, some now professional, to the hobby and art of home brewing, including me. I've been brewing for almost 20 years, and it's because of Andy. Andy got me into brewing not long after the shop got going. But this Saturday, there's going to be a big celebration at the home brewery in Fayetteville that will include demonstrations, live music, refreshments, and such. And there will also be an after party at Fossil Cove Brewing Saturday night. So if you're in the Northwest Arkansas area this weekend on Saturday, be sure to come by and congratulate Andy and the home brewery crew on an outstanding 20 years of promoting and supporting home brewing in Northwest Arkansas. If you've been listening to the show for the past 2 weeks, you've been following my continuing saga of my apparently accidental Oktoberfest session beer. I brewed 100% Vienna malt Oktoberfest, and the mash went great. Fermentation appeared vigorous and good, but the attenuation just wasn't what I expected. And I asked you out there if you had experience with 100% Vienna malt bills, and whether that matched your experience. And I heard from a few of you. Grant from Birmingham, Alabama, or if you're in the UK, Birmingham, Alabama, writes, I thought I'd throw in my 2 cents on Vienna malt since you mentioned it in today's podcast. Last spring, I brewed a Vienna lager with 100% Vienna malt, and I didn't have any problems. I had an original gravity of 1055 and a final gravity of 1013. However, this beer was different from yours in a couple of ways. I did a double decoction mash with rests at 122 and 154, followed by a mash out. I used WLP 830 German lager yeast and fermented at standard lager yeast temperatures. The beer turned out great, Grant says. He also says, for what it's worth, I'll mention that I've used the Oktoberfest strain from White Labs a few times, and I remember it being really slow to start. Not sure if this has anything to do with your issue. Thanks, Grant. I don't think it does, because fermentation started quickly on mine. I had a 2-liter starter and fermented it at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the yeast appeared very happy. Holger Michaelis, who we met in San Diego and talked about small batch lagers, wrote in. Holger says, the Vienna lager I got you to try at the NHC was nearly 100% Vienna malt, 5 pounds plus half an ounce of Carafa 3 for color adjustment in 3.9 gallons, brew in a bag mash, single infusion for 90 minutes. The pH held steady at 5.4, and the temps were kept between 65 and 68 C. Both OG and FG were within a point of the targets. As far as I could tell, full conversion occurred. That was a tasty beer. But I did not take pH readings on my mash, on my beer. Thanks, Holger. Derek writes in with this: I did a series of 100% Vienna malt beers because they turned out so well for me. None of them had problems attenuating. I was using Best Malts malt. I really enjoyed the extra character from the Vienna malt and have been using it much more in all my brewing. I did an Amarillo Pale Ale using US-05 that went from 1047 to 1011. Then I did 100% Vienna Saison using the Belle Saison yeast that went from 1069 to 1008. I did another pale ale with US-05 that went from 1063 to 1015, and a Belgian pale ale a Belgian ale with Y yeast 1388 that went from 1067 to 1014. So Derek also says, I did learn something from a previous set of experiments that may apply to this situation. I attempted a 100% Munich malt beer and had similar results to you. It didn't attenuate well. I had heard that Munich malt had enough enzymes to convert itself, so assumed that this would be fine. I later learned that there is not any regulation of malt naming, and the Munich malt I had basically had no enzymatic activity. Essentially, I just steeped the malt instead of mashing. I learned that I needed to check on the specific malt I had to make sure it would have enough enzyme activity to convert. I would pull the malt sheet for your specific malt and check the diastatic power. By the way, Derek says, as a side note, the mistake with the 100% Munich beer turned into a great sour beer after I added bugs to get the beer to finish. It also encouraged me to try a 100% crystal malt beer. It's already converted, so I shouldn't have to mash it all, right? I did a 100% crystal English mild that turned out very well. It finished at 1017, but that worked just fine with the style. Interesting. It turns out the Vienna malt that I used was from Briess, and all the spec sheets and everything that I can find indicate that it converts with no problems. So I don't know. Maybe I just took a bad hydrometer reading when I racked the beer. I don't know. The beer tastes good. I'm planning to rack next week into a keg, so I'll update you then. I appreciate all the information. It's great to have a resource of brewers out there. Before we move on talking about small, sour barrels, let's talk about our ongoing sponsors, Desiree and Dave from High Gravity in Tulsa. They have an awesome website, as I've said on the show before, and part of it that makes it so often awesome, is the Build Your Own Beer function. The Build Your Own Beer at highgravitybrew.com lets you select all your ingredients from one page, including adjuncts, yeast, priming options, fruit flavorings, and purees. You can even name your beer on that page. And the total for your recipe updates live there at the bottom of the window, so you don't have to scroll to see it. It's very neat. High Gravity offers flat rate shipping of $7.99 on most items. And if you're new to brewing or want to get a gift for somebody who should get into brewing, High Gravity has a Build Your Own Starter Kit that lets you add onto the basic kit all on one page. Check it all out, including the awesome electric systems that they have at highgravitybrew.com. Okay, a couple episodes ago, we talked to Nick and Kurt Keast about their small barrel progression experiment. That was a very fun conversation with some very tasty beers. Well, this week we're going to talk a little deeper about small barrels with CJ Shamas, who is using small barrels to produce a series of sour beers. CJ Shamas, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks, James, for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
We're going to talk about small barrels, and a while back on the show was one of the Amazon things that someone had bought. It was a book, and I think it was called Small Barrels Make Lousy Whiskey. And I tried to look that book up on Amazon today, and I couldn't find it, so I don't know what happened.
Okay.
So maybe I just imagined that, but I take it that you don't care whether small barrels make lousy whiskey. Your contention is that small barrels make good beer, right?
Absolutely. Not only good beer, but great beer. And more specifically, the best beer in the world, which is, of course, sour beer.
Now, we talked a little bit before we started recording about the show we did in San Diego with Nick and Kurt Keast,
yep,
and what they did with their small barrel. And I take it that you said that you had some differences with your approach, not saying that one approach is right and another approach is wrong, but kind of talk about that. How did
Sure.
Since the conversation with the Keiths is so fresh in our mind.
Well, Nick and Kurt, their approach, I think is outstanding. Your last episode, I believe, with Chris Colby, he said the word or inferred to experimentation as a home brewer numerous times. And in essence, what I really like about what Nick and Kurt did was, they took something that they didn't know a whole lot about and have never really worked with before, buying that 8-gallon whiskey barrel. And they experimented and they learned. And that is a fundamental aspect of home brewing. And if you're going to produce outstanding or even very good sour beers, particularly barrel-aged ones, you got to be willing to experiment. So I don't want to say that the approach that we'll talk about today that I take is the right approach. I wouldn't say that at all. It's just the approach that I found works best for me. And if you're interested in taking small barrels and producing sour beers, I would advocate that this method would work for you as well. So with Nick and Kurt, in essence, what they had done, just to recap, is that 8-gallon spirit barrel that they got, they produced a number of non-sour beers through them. And it kind of ranged in style. And what I enjoyed about the episode is as they drank the beer and you guys drank the beer, you really talked about it and identified some flaws in it and identified what you liked in it. And certainly that is going to be a fundamental factor in working with small barrels.
So how would you encapsulate your approach, your strategy?
So it first starts with your mentality. I would basically suggest that if you're going to get into small barrels, you really want to be utilizing them to produce sour beers. I don't necessarily, if I didn't produce sour beers, I probably wouldn't own a small barrel. It's a little difficult to constantly be having these barley wines and very heavy, strong beers. It's a style I like, but I probably wouldn't own a barrel. So in essence, it really starts with a mentality, and the mentality is a barrel. You got to think of it as in terms of like a program. And it's a series of beers that you're going to put through this barrel in order to really maximize what the barrel's going to offer you at certain times in its life. And what I would do is I would take that barrel, and first of all, you got to source the barrel. Then you got to prepare the barrel. We could certainly touch upon that. And then you got to start and basically making beers to go into that barrel. And the first beer that I would put in a barrel is not a sour beer. I would actually put something in. This is what I do regularly when I get a fresh barrel, specifically a spirits barrel. As a home brewer, when you source barrels, you're really looking at small barrels. You can certainly buy the 55 or 60 gallon, but it brings on a set of problems that are kind of difficult to overcome. How do you produce 55 or 60 gallons? Let's call it 60. How do you produce that much beer? When the beer is done, what the heck do you do with that much? If you're in a club and there's a number of people contributing to it, it could certainly work. But you're doing it by yourself or even with one other person, as I do regularly with my brother James, these small barrels are ideal. So when we refer to a small barrel, we're basically talking about between a 5 to 15 gallon barrel. Most common and what is most accessible to the home brewer are used spirits barrel, similar to the barrel that Nick and Kurt purchased. They purchased an 8 gallon. And so you're getting these spirit barrels. You can find them online. I would certainly recommend if there's a local distillery to go there and try to source them. As soon as they get dumped, grab it. And then you are taking that barrel and it's part of your rotation. It's part of a particular program. So now I got to get a beer in there. What am I going to do? If you've never had a imperial stout that's been aged and call it a bourbon barrel or whiskey barrel, they're outstanding. Same could be said for barley wines if that's your thing. So now you're thinking of it in terms of this program. I source the barrel, I prepare the barrel. First beer through is a non-sour beer. Make it a huge beer. Really challenge yourself. The bigger, the better. And that's going to begin the process of essentially stripping the spirit. So you're kind of degrading how much spirit is left in that barrel. I wouldn't leave it in there for more than a couple months, anywhere from probably 6 weeks to maybe 10 weeks. That's pretty much ideal. You're really going to get a lot of that bourbon out in that first beer, or a significant portion, I should say. You're going to be very surprised on how good that beer is going to come out, especially if you like the style. I wouldn't discourage from doing a second clean beer. I haven't done that before, only because when I buy these barrels, it's about getting them ready to produce outstanding sour beers. So after your first clean beer, now you're thinking about your sour beers, and you're really starting that sequence of sour beer production through the barrel.
So the first beer, you want it to be a big beer to stand up to those strong, boozy characters that are coming out of that leftover whatever was in rum or whiskey or bourbon or whatever was in before.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of oak character, as we discovered in with Nick and Kurt. There's a lot of oak character in the first, certainly the first beer, and maybe the first couple beers. So let's back up a little bit. I mean, what kinds of barrels are we looking for? What kinds of barrels are we not looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Where do you get them?
Yeah, so they sell there's a number of different barrels available. You can get barrels. I've seen them 1 liter, 2 liter. The staves are extremely thin. They'll have a spigot attached. Those are the barrels that I would avoid. The barrels that you're really looking for are well built. The staves are going to be nice and thick. If you stay in this idea that you're buying used spirits barrel, you're going to know that the barrel has basically held a liquid before. Buying from a distillery, it's going to be of quality. I've used homebrewfinds.com. I've come across them. Local distilleries I've contacted. I purchased one from a place in New York. I forget the exact name of the distillery. But between my brother and I, we're pushing over 10 barrels. And when you get them, it doesn't mean they're perfect, and it doesn't mean, oh my God, they're ready for beer as soon as I get them. But you definitely want to have the beer brewed upon receiving. You don't want them to dry out. So essentially what would happen is you would source these barrels, think in terms of these 5 to 15 gallons. I think that you'll do very well. Certainly the bigger they are, the more challenging they are. And the off sizes, I have a 3 gallon that's extremely well built. I have the 8 gallon as well from Woodville Whiskey, but they create some challenge. And if you're not into blending, or if you're not there yet, I would think of it in terms of your fermentation size. So if you're doing batches of 5 gallons, I would be sourcing a 5 gallon barrel. A whiskey, a bourbon, a rum. I have a rum barrel that I absolutely love. We could talk about later. But essentially, think of it in terms of whatever you're fermenting. If it's not a 1-to-1, it may be a sort of a 2-to-1. So a 10 gallon batch, or I'm sorry, 10 gallon barrel. If you're brewing 5 gallon batches, and you could double it up. But the easiest thing to do is the 5 gallon barrel. Those are perfect. You could even lift them when you're doing transfers. When you get bigger than that, they get really heavy and they become difficult to maneuver and move. So you source the barrel, and then you got to kind of prepare the barrel. As soon as I get a barrel, the first thing I'm doing is I'm flushing the barrel. So I literally will take a clean garden hose. I will flush it with water, and just, remember, these barrels are going to be charred. So you're going to get a little char out of it. You're going to start stripping away some of that bourbon or whiskey or spirit. I've received whiskey in particular barrels that even have a little whiskey left. You want to try to get that out as soon as you can. Then what I'll do is I'll do a little sanitation of the inside of the barrel with about 180 degree water. So I receive the barrel, I do a visual inspection. Okay, looks good to me. I then rinse it. I then do 180 degree water, kind of flush it around as carefully as I can. And then I'm going to try to swell the barrel, and I'm going to check for leaks, and I'm going to ensure that the barrel is okay. This thing can hold some beer. There's a couple different methods for swelling. What I've utilized is I fill it with cold water. You don't want to fill it with hot water. That would certainly help mold growth, and which again you wouldn't definitely not want. So I'm going to fill a thing with some cold water. I'm going to swell it. If you get little leaks in it, don't worry. It's wood. It needs a little time to just kind of absorb that liquid and really swell. Typically, leaks, the bad ones, are going to happen on the end caps. Anything that's a small leak between the staves, don't fret, don't worry. I even put beer in when there's a little bit of a leak, and over a couple days, the sugars in the beer will solidify, and it'll create like a natural plug. Anything bad off the end caps, you have to be a little bit more concerned about. One great method is add the little ratchet and straps you can buy at the local hardware store and see if you can kind of cinch the barrel up. What Jay Goodwin does at Rare Barrel, which I think is a great technique I've yet to employ, but I'm certainly going to try on my next barrel, is when he receives a barrel, he puts it vertically and he adds water to the one of the end caps. Okay, so he fills the end cap up and he lets it just sit. I don't know how long he sits. I'm gathering probably hours or half a day. And if the water kind of sits there and doesn't do anything, he knows that end cap's not going to leak. And that might be just a really good first step. You get the barrel, check the end cap kind of thing. I've yet to do it. My next barrel, I'm certainly going to do it.
So how long do you let the cold water sit in there yourself to swell the barrel?
I do that for 24 hours. I would recommend no more than 48 hours. Being that it's a spirits barrel, I'm less worried about the growth of mold. Really, at this point, what I'm trying to do is get rid of some of that spirits flavor and swell the barrel. Another strategy that you can do is get a plastic tub, and essentially submerge the oak barrel in the plastic tub. Never needed to do it, but it is another strategy. So I give it about a day, and then afterwards I dump it. I have also added 180-degree water one more time, though at this point I don't think that's necessary. I am not one that adds chemicals to my barrels, particularly because, again, they're spirits barrels, and that the residual alcohol left in the wood. It's not really an environment where I think mold is going to grow. I've never really had that, so I'm at this point comfortable adding beer. What I've also done, and I would say this is an optional step, is I've added some inexpensive but drinkable red wine or white wine to the barrel and kind of sloshed it around a little bit. I've left that in there for a day or two and just kind of turned it around, and just to help strip some more of that spirit. Alcohol is a solvent, and that'll certainly help to prepare your barrel. Once you're set with barrel preparation, get beer in it. So, if I'm ordering a barrel or I'm buying a barrel, the beer is already brewed that is going to go into the barrel. So after the preparation, boom, I'm hitting it with my, Russian Imperial Stout, and now I'm going to let it age. And again, I'm going to let it age between, 4 weeks to 12 weeks kind of thing. You don't need to go beyond that. If you have to, it's not the end of the world, but you really don't need to do that. So now you're kind of in your sequence of taking this barrel and turning it into something that's going to really produce outstanding beer, outstanding sour beer. But really what you're looking at is trying to maximize the benefits of the barrel in each step, in each sequential brew. So the first brew, big beer, clean beer, get some of that spirit into the beer. The first sour beer that I suggest people do is something really big and robust. I suggest doing a Flemish Red if you like that style, but it's got to be something big because you're still going to have some of that spirit flavor left. And when you brew something big, it will complement the sour beer. It'll be another flavor addition. It'll be another layer of flavor versus it fighting with the flavors. If you did something like something non-sour, let's say, your second beer through or following your clean beers, you want to produce a Brett only beer. You're gonna really struggle with the flavors because the acidity is key at this point. I really believe that the acidity of a beer can stand up to that spirit and wood character, and they can sort of complement each other if they're at the right levels. If when you transfer that beer out, if it's not to your taste, I would definitely consider blending. We can talk about that in depth later, but essentially you do not want to blend down the acidity at this point. If you do start blending acidity down, the perception of the spirit and the wood will actually increase. So first sour beer, make it big, make it robust. Flemish Reds are great. Wyeast, Roselaire yeast, I'm a big fan of. Stick it in there, let it age. And now when we're talking about aging in the barrel for sour beer, being that they're small barrels, you want to be thinking in terms of 6 months to 9 months. You don't need to do it for years. I think that when you do that, your issues with oxygen ingress increases, and you start producing some potential off flavors. Acetic acid can be produced. So think of it in terms of 6 months, 9 months, and you can produce some outstanding sour beers.
Now, are there any differences between small barrels and big barrels in that capacity? I mean, are small barrels better because they don't transfer as much oxygen as a big barrel? Or talk about the differences physically. Are there any advantages or disadvantages to the smaller size?
Yeah, so you're going to have a higher ratio in the smaller barrels of volume of your beer to surface area of the wood. So essentially, you're going to sour faster. You're going to have more oxygen ingress than a larger barrel. Even though the barrels are bigger themselves, think of it in terms of the volume of the liquid to the surface area of the wood. So the smaller the barrel, the shorter the aging time. It is an advantage in the small barrels. But there are some disadvantages. You really do have to watch when you're dealing with small barrels that and you probably have to do this as well as larger barrels, but even more so with the smaller barrels. You have to be very careful about oxygen ingress. So anytime you're doing a transfer, I suggest purging with CO2. Stick in your CO2 tubing or get a wand and fill it up with CO2. Anytime you're taking a sample, backload it with some CO2. Everything that you can do to kind of keep oxygen out is beneficial. Some people actually top off their barrels. I did it for a little bit and kind of backed away from that as an idea. I would also kind of, just as a best practice with dealing with sour beer, try to keep your pellicle intact. And so if you're dealing with a small barrel, you can do the Vinnie nail method where you're drilling a hole in the side and add a stainless steel nail to it. So your samples, essentially, you're not breaking the pellicle. But with the smaller barrels, if you just think of them in terms of you're aging for months, not years, you're going to be fine.
Now, Nick and Kurt talked about coating their small barrel with paraffin or wax at one point to actually, stop the angel share. And I guess at that same time, it probably either stops or cuts down significantly on oxygen ingress as well.
You want a little bit of oxygen, but you want it at the micro level. That was one thing in their methods that I would not do, and I would suggest to people that they don't do this. I don't really get the whole concept of wax in the barrel. Yes, it's going to cut off the oxygen and things of that nature. If that's what you want to do, age it in glass carboy. The advantages of an oak barrel, one of them is you're going to get micro oxygenation, and that is a benefit. So I wouldn't wax. With that said, I am big on experimenting. So I do want to say I've never done it. But I would advocate that you don't need to do it.
It's an interesting. It's an interesting point. I mean, if you're going to stop, I mean, if you're at a certain point where you're not getting, a lot of the flavors from the wood anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I can see your point where, you might as well be aging in glass at that point if you're going to cut out all the oxygen. Although, I've never done it before either.
Yeah,
way, so.
I haven't either. And what happens is, again, we go back to this. A barrel is a program, so eventually, what will happen? So many beers down the line that the essence of the spirit will still be there, but it will be faint, and it will be a flavor addition. It will be an added layer. It will not be upfront and a punch to the face and, oh my God, how am I dealing with this spirit or this wood? And also, each use, if you clean the barrel the right way and you don't necessarily sanitize the barrel, which I would suggest you don't do, you are going to have microbes in that barrel that are living. And some of the microbes are anaerobic and some actually do well with a little bit of oxygen. So with each batch, what I've learned to do is essentially just give it a once-over rinse. I've also incorporated a modified Solera where I don't rinse it. I don't take out all the beer. Our 15-gallon barrel that I share with my brother, to deal with 15 gallons is a little tricky. We have an outside brew that we can do 10 gallons. So in essence, what we do is we pull 10 out and we put a fresh 10 in. So, but the other barrels, what I essentially do is I take the beer out and I'm going to really just do a quick rinse with some cold water, and boom, next beer is going right back in it. I mean, it's empty for a matter of a couple minutes.
And I gotta say, before we get too far away from Nick and Kurt's beers, they were all tasty. So, they say the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. Whatever they were doing worked well for those particular beers. Whether not coating the barrel would have come out with a different beer, is another question. Maybe if you're worried about oxygen ingress, maybe you only coat half the barrel.
Yeah, hey, listen, I'm about trying things and something might work for you. And what I really liked about what they did, again, is just the fact that they're experimenting and are working with this is awesome. My approach is a little different, and that is, listen, we're going to get these barrels, and in each step, we want to maximize what the barrel offers at the certain time in its life phase. And when I mean life phase, essentially, how many beers have gone through it? What's the treatment of the barrel? And with this understanding that we're trying to make great sour beers as soon as we can and in every single batch.
So you've got having lots of small barrels as opposed to one big barrel. Mm-hmm. It frees you up to do different things in each barrel. And I assume that you take that as part of your strategy, as you're going to do X with one barrel, Y with another barrel, and Z with a third barrel, and then blend those resulting beers together, or not, depending on how they turn out. I assume that's your approach.
Yeah, I do. You know what's funny? I do a ton of blending. At this point, I'm convinced that you can make outstanding sour beers in barrels, but you will blow your mind. You will make just amazing beers. You can take good beers and make them great. You can make beers that are, wow, this is too boozy. This is too acidic. This is not acidic enough. And when blended properly, they become great. So blending is a key. Now, I don't necessarily take blends of different barrels and blend them together. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but typically, you kind of alluded to it, each barrel is in its own phase of its program. So I haven't necessarily found a need to do that, but I would do that. I wouldn't object to say, okay, I'm going to blend a little bit out of this barrel here because it has some more spirit or it has some more acidity, and blend it with something that doesn't. What I end up basically doing is at this point, I have carboys of all different sizes. I'm a big advocate of these 1 gallon jugs. I have kegs of different sizes. And in each batch, when I sample it and I say, okay, what is this beer presenting? What are some of the benefits of it? What are some of the strengths of it? But what is it really missing? I typically won't bottle an entire batch. I'll kind of break the batch up. And so what I have on hand at any one time is I have clean beers for blending. I have 100% Brettanomyces beers for blending. I have very acidic beers that you would not want to drink straight, but when blended at the right ratio with the right beer, just elevates a particular beer, a particular style. And I also have beers that at different sequences of the barrel program where it's like, wow, this beer has a good backbone to it, too much spirit.
Now, on the approach to the different bugs in the different barrels, we've talked to homebrewers who and tasted beers from them. That they went to a sour beer party and took all the dregs from all the good beers that they liked and poured all of them into their barrel, to get all of those bugs going. What's your approach? I mean, do you have a more kind of pure approach to trying to narrow the range of bugs in each barrel?
So I have done the dregs approach where I'm taking dregs from different bottles. Mike Tonsmeyer has a very, as you know, his blog is outstanding, and he on the blog even gives you bottles where there's healthy microbes in those beers, so those would be good bottles to buy to do cultivations of. I have done that. I have done that with good results, and I've done that with some mixed results. I've also done some different mixed fermentations. I really do a lot of experimenting, so I can't definitively say to you, James, listen, I only do it this way because I don't. I've blended yeast, I blended bacterias, I add yeast, Brett, and bacteria at different times in fermentation to different barrels. So it's just kind of like when we first set this up, we had this on Skype, and you had a video on me, and I don't know if you could see over my shoulder, but there's cultures of 10 different cultures of different yeasts and bacteria. So depending on what I'm trying to produce, I'm going to mix and I'm going to blend.
Which is another advantage to the small batches. If something doesn't go exactly the way you planned, you're not losing a whole lot.
Yeah, exactly.
If something does go wacky and you get a mixture of bugs, microorganisms in a small barrel that you're not happy with, is there any going back? Can you reset that barrel?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if it doesn't go right, I'm going to figure out who I can blame. I'm kidding.
Your brother.
Yeah. So that's right. That's right. He's actually an awesome home brewer. So let me first answer the question. If you have a barrel and it doesn't produce your desired results, okay, you got to identify what the heck is going on. So evaluation is a real key component, just as an umbrella thing with producing sour beers. And I would say, or with producing any beer, and I would say that is one thing that people can do. You don't have to buy equipment to properly evaluate. And so I'm very blessed with a great group of friends, some cousins and my brother, that we all just love sour beer, and it's a very social event when we get together. And what happens is when we're drinking beers, particularly ones that we have brewed, my brother's brewed, I've brewed, we've collaborated on, we're not high-fiving each other and being like, wow, this beer is great, we are great brewers. It's, what do you taste? What do you like? What don't you like? And it's very infrequent that he and I are satisfied with the beer and we're like, wow, we're going to brew this exact beer the exact same way. I can't think of a beer that I've ever made that is a sour beer that I'm like, I want to do it exactly the same way next time. So evaluation, and it doesn't cost anything to evaluate. It's probably an ego thing. So you got to kind of check your ego at the door and seek critical feedback from people that know good beers. I actually find that just with my group of friends, we're much less critical about commercial beers. And many times I'm even thinking to myself, if I made this beer, I would be crushing it right now. I would be, wow, this is flaw. There's a flaw here. There's a flaw there. But when you buy it, it's like, oh, okay. As a home brewer, my friends are a little bit trained, and the first thing they want to say is, what's wrong with it? How could it be better? And many times they're very good, but there's something there that we can improve on. So I'm giving you a bit of a long-winded answer, but with the evaluation component of it, think about, where is the beer? Was there a flaw in my process, or is just a flavor, such as if you're dealing with spirits barrels, is there excessive amount of spirit? So if that's the case, or there's extra acidity, too much acidity in the beer, or the beer's not totally balanced, that's when blending becomes key, because it's not like you've just produced a diacetyl bomb that it's like, okay, well, there was some kind of flaw in my processes. I frankly have not had a beer that came out of a barrel that I was like, this is absolutely disgusting and it has to be dumped. If I did, I would dump it. If that happened and you were convinced that there was microflora that got in that are just like, wow, this is bad. There's something that went very bad here, and we're in trouble with this barrel. What I would do is I would rinse it thoroughly, and I would put in 180-degree water. I would even consider, I'm not necessarily saying I would do this, but I would even consider dousing it with some fresh wine, or throwing a few ounces of, a bourbon in there or something to kind of kill it. I have found that 180-degree water kills most of the microbes. I can't definitively say that it's going to kill the Brettanomyces that may have embedded into the wood. It appears as though Brett can kind of really sneak into the wood, up to an 1/8 inch deep into the wood. And what I have found in my own home brewing and working with barrels is it's difficult to kill that Brett. I don't really want to kill it. But there's times where I'll use a barrel and I'll say, I've used Rose Layer so much in the past, where I'm like, wow, this next beer, I don't want the Rose Layer blend in there. So, I want to use a 3-step fermentation. So I'm going to do, lacto and Saccharomyces, and I'm going to transfer it in the barrel and age it with Brett in the barrel. Well, if the Rose Layer is in there, the Rose Layer, as I say, will ferment water. So you want that Rose Layer out. And if that's the case, I'm rinsing it 180-degree water, and in my mind, it's as fresh of a barrel as I really need.
So you're just trying to pasteurize a bit.
Just a bit, because again, some of these bugs are just pretty aggressive. And if you're trying to use a different blend or a different bacteria, or you want, like, for instance, I've used PDO before, and I'm like, I just really want to know how PDO is produced, how much acidity is the PDO going to produce in this particular beer that I'm making. And so my experiment, to kind of keep it controlled, you want the past microbes to kind of be out of the picture. Again, the 180-degree water, I think, is the trick.
So what are options when we're blending? What strategies do you use when you actually blend the beers together?
So blending right now is I'm so excited about blending because, the old mentality of one barrel, one beer is out the window. And I've made many of beers that I was like, wow, this is good, but missing something. It's one note, whatever it is. And so I've just gotten really excited about blending because I've made some beers that, when put together, it's mind-blowing. Separate, okay, mind-blowing. So what I would suggest to somebody that's really starting, because it's a tricky thing, blending is definitely a tricky thing. The first thing I would do is I would say, just try blending beers in a glass. So one thing you can do is, if you're making sour beer, for somebody that's first making sour beer, it's just exciting to make a beer that's acidic. Mm-hmm. And if you use, something if you make a beer that's like too acidic and it's burning your throat, what I like to do is brew a Saison and have a clean Saison. I have a little tap system, or you brew a clean Saison and just blend Saison with very sour beer and do it in the glass and try different portions of it and just get comfortable with the mental hurdles of taking two different beers and blending them to make one beer. So that's the beginner phase, is blend in a glass. And what you also find is what doesn't work. So if you have a very clean but roasty beer and you add a heavy amount of acidity, the roasted and the acidity tend to clash with each other. The next thing that you can do in terms of the blending spectrum is blend it in a barrel. So particularly if you have like one of these off sizes. So like we were referring to the 3-gallon or even better, the 8-gallon barrel. If you're brewing 5-gallon batches, to fill that 8-gallon barrel, you got to brew 2 batches. You're going to blend to get in there. What you also can do is blend, instead of exactly the same beer, slightly different beers. So what I've done with my 8-gallon whiskey barrel is I've blended in 5 gallons of a Flemish Red. It actually, I'm sorry, it was about 6.5 gallons of Flemish Red and the rest of 100% Brett beer because I was trying to tone back some of that acidity. And it's really an experiment because I blend my Flemish Reds kind of when they're finished to blend down some of the acidity. And hey, let's blend it in the barrel and let's see how that the Roselaire yeast blend will kind of do when it's blended with a Brett beer. The other thing that you can do, and this is I highly recommend, and it's very safe to do, is blend post-fermentation in carboys. So you're done with your sour beer. Hopefully you're using barrels at this point. So you take a sample. Wow, it's too acidic. Wow, it's too boozy. Or it's good, but. So put that in a carboy. With a portion of maybe a clean beer, maybe a Brett beer, maybe the same beer that wasn't oak aged, and blend in the carboy. This is always a great opportunity to add fruit. I'm a big advocate for adding fruit. Fruit can be a great addition in your barrel program when you're first making sour beers in the spirits barrel. When they're first coming out of a barrel and they're boozy, you don't want to blend down the acidity, but you do want to add some complexity. And a really cool thing to do is take that beer and add fruit, maybe a fresh dose of Brett or Lacto or PDO or not. And you'll just get another level of flavor there, another level of complexity, and it'll kind of work with that spirits taste.
And doing it in the carboy also allows the beers to stabilize.
Well, that's the big thing, too, especially if you're not seasoned at blending. If you start blending at bottling and you're blending different vintages, or I should say clean beer, sour beer, yeast, Brett beer, sour beer, the potential for bottle bombs is there. And you need to do everything you possibly can to avoid bottle bombs, for sure. So with these glass carboys, you could even watch, even if you're not taking readings and samples and watching the gravity, which you should, but even if you're not doing that, you can kind of see the CO2 kind of dissipate in it, and all of a sudden the beer stabilizes. You could even watch your airlock, and then even at that, give it a little bit more time. But it's a great strategy to employ. It's certainly in my toolbox. Then the next part of it is blending in your serving container. So let's say blend it in a keg. Again, it is safe to do that because in a keg you can vent out any excessive carbonation, any pressure that builds up. It's a great strategy. Blend in a keg. Why not?
And it's just going to be at a colder temperature as well. If you're blending and then serving, it's going to be cooler and it's going to slow down the activity of the bugs a bit.
No doubt. Yeah, that's a very good point too, James. The last thing, and this is the most advanced, and it's the most difficult for homebrewers in particular to do, because getting samples and doing ratios of beers is very challenging for the homebrewer. It's tough. It's getting into the carboy, going into your oak barrel. It's very, very difficult to do. But in my mind, the most advanced technique is blending it at bottling. So if you blend that bottle, it creates a lot of challenges. Again, that feared bottle bombs. So you really need to know your microbes at this point. You really need to understand what they're capable of doing. You need to have check your gravities, and also considerations of what you're blending with. I would say your first step at that point is you can blend it with the same beer, maybe not oak aged, for instance. So if I made a Flemish red and it was half was in an oak barrel and the other half wasn't, I would consider blending that as kind of like step one in the processes. Step two is blending it with something of different microbes or non-sour. You just got to be very careful when you do that. What I suggest people do is, if you're going to do that, let's refer to it as your clean side. When that gets blended in, have that as the minority of the ratio. So majority is your sour beer. So maybe it's a 3 parts sour beer, 1 part, or 4 to 1. I would also use a Brett or a Saccharomyces that is going to gobble up all those sugars. I have really great, I've used often with great success, the Belle Saison yeast, which I want to say is the French Saison yeast. And man, that thing ferments down to like 0.001. And so there is like nothing left for bugs to kind of chew on, although we know that Brettanomyces will kind of break down complex carbohydrates. But if you only add a little bit to it at bottling, I have found that you can really make awesome beers blended at bottling.
Yeah, and just to clarify for those who aren't getting what we're talking about, if you have beer A with yeast A that has some residual sugars that yeast A can't, it's done with, it's not going to eat those, and then you have yeast B and beer B, and that yeast is more aggressive at eating those residual sugars. If you blend them together and then put some priming sugar in there as well, yeast B may eat some of the leftover stuff from yeast from beer A and cause a lot more carbonation or a lot more pressure in the bottle than you're counting on. So you're actually over priming that beer in the bottle.
Yeah, no doubt, and that's the big fear. Again, that's later in your development as a brewer. I would say that's an advanced technique, but you could start blending in a glass, and each step and each success, challenge yourself and experiment. And what I would even suggest to do is, if you were to do this at bottling, only do a few bottles in your first time, and sample it as it ages, and even stick them in the back of your cellar or your beer closet. And then sample it a year down the road and see what it's done. Experiment is key. You'll learn a lot about your own brewery, your bugs that hopefully you're cultivating, you're feeding, you're nurturing, your barrels. Experiment is key.
And you might want to check one of the bottles, after a couple weeks to see if too much pressure is building up.
What I do, James, is not only do I have different size carboys and oak barrels, but I also use different size bottles. I'll even bottle into, I think they're 4 ounces, but they may only be 3-ounce bottles. And I will open a beer every single week. So, if I just did a blended sour Saison, which is one of my favorite styles, works extremely well with my rum barrel. Now I'm blending that with some clean some clean Saison. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those small beers, those 4-ounce bottles, and after a week, pop it. How's the carbonation? What's going on in the bottle? Is there any diacetyl bloom? Anything going on? Okay, another week goes by, sample it. And I'll literally sample right through to the point I'm like, okay, it's stable in a bottle, the flavor stabilized, great. Aging, it's time to really, sit on it and forget about them for a while.
Well, it sounds like we're just scratching the surface in talking about blending, and we are, because there's going to be a part 2.
Great.
CJ has promised to send us beers from his barrel program that have been blended, and that way we can demonstrate, actually, with a tasting, of what you're talking about, the principles that you're talking about. So if you have questions on what we have so far, send them to me, and when we get back together, we can address those questions in a special part 2, where hopefully Steve and maybe Andy and I can get together and do the fun part of sampling some beers. So it's a very, very informative so far. And like I say, this is I don't know that we've done this in this way specifically before, but I like the way it's worked out. If you have questions for CJ, send them to me. We'll talk about the answers to those questions on the next show. And boy, am I looking forward to the next show. So CJ, I appreciate all the information. Getting into small barrels is one of my goals. One that I haven't moved any closer to. But it's always good to have information, sort of in the pocket for when that opportunity might arise.
Well, thanks, James. I'm a huge fan of the show. I find it so informative, and it's helped raise my own home brewing to the next level. So to be on is a real honor. And one of my goals when you're sampling these beers is to maybe inspire you to get those oak barrels, because if you have a basement, it's time you fill them with barrels.
I'll have to empty it out first, but it's already full. All right. Awesome, CJ. I appreciate it.
Thank you, James. Have a great day.
Well, thanks again to CJ. I'm very much looking forward to tasting the fruit of CJ's labors and his brother James. We'll get back together and chat when those bottles arrive. And as I said, if you have questions for CJ, send them to me, and we can talk about them on the next installment when we get back together. You can send those questions, show suggestions, or if you just want to say howdy, you can write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. You can get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener with any DVD combo, and you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store as well. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Featured products this week that were purchased through the link are 1967 Chevrolet Chevelle Owner's Manual User Guide. Very cool. And the editing of Star Wars, How Cutting Created a Classic. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget you can also join the American Homebrewers Association or subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrew.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.